Is this my rebuttal time?
Well, I have rebuttal, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
By way of rebuttal, I basically like to point out, Dan brought up the free will and omniscience argument that he calls Fang. The problems with this argument are multiply. Briefly, it assumes a libertarian view of God, which I deny. It further assumes God is in time, and his choices are, rather than his choices being made timelessly. Therefore, it begs the question against my worldview on those two scores. Moreover, Mr. Barker does not think man has libertarian freedom. Indeed, on Gene Cook's show on Unchained Radio, he told us all that man isn't free. And all of our choices are made certain and determined by the laws of physics. Therefore, Mr. Barker is not a person according to his own argument. But if Mr. Barker wants to escape this critique and says since he acts free and is uncertain about the future, then 3 points should suffice to rebut this claim. If it should be granted that it's theoretically possible, given physicalism, to find out in advance how we'll respond to certain situations. Indeed, many physicalists are committed to this project. If they succeed, will Mr. Barker say that at that point persons cease to exist? Point 2, infants do not, quote, act as if they were free, unquote. Therefore, are infants not persons? Point number 3, if Dan were to, it's theoretically possible to conceive of, as a thought experiment, time travel. If Dan were able to go back in time and make his choice again, but this time he knew it was certain and he knew the choice that he would make because he had already made it, would Dan consider himself not a person then? Secondly, by way of rebuttal, Dan says concepts, universals and such exist in physical brains, and exist in minds which are in physical brains. There's many problems. 1, concepts are not physical, and so it does no good for physicalists to appeal to concepts. 2, this view fails to say why an object has the properties it has. A realist will argue that the reason a ball is red is because it has the property redness. It's not red because we call it red. So this does not solve the problem, which is why is it appropriate to ascribe redness rather than blueness to a ball? Or take the contingency problem. There are properties that are necessary, such as 7 being an odd number. That's true in all possible worlds. But human minds are not necessary, and so the concept, being odd-numbered, cannot exist in human minds. Take the temporality problem. That is, before humans existed, the sun was hot and bright. Thus, the properties hotness and brightness at least could not have existed in human minds. Otherwise, the sun was not hot and bright until the advent of human minds. 5, the many minds problem asks, whose mind is, say, redness a property of or exist in? Do we have Dan Barker redness, Paul Manata redness, Gene Cook redness, Reggie Finley redness? No. Now, if Mr. Barker wants to hold that universals exist in a mind, and since there are, as proven, necessary, eternal, and singular concepts and universals, then it follows that at least concepts have existed in a necessary, eternal, and singular mind. Therefore, Mr. Barker must either abandon his conceptualism or his atheism. Which will it be? Dan Barker gave a functionalist account of the mind tonight. We could start here by mentioning atheist John Searle's comment that if you are tempted towards functionalism, I believe you do not need refutation, you need help. Here's why. Functionalism taken as cause-functional stance regarding the mind says all explanations of the mental must be given in physical, non-rational, non-purposive terms. Functionalism can account for qualia, or what it is like to, say, be in pain, intentionality, the mind's being about something, or norms of reason. Indeed, Mr. Barker cannot account for this debate given his functionalism. There is a certain feel to, quote-unquote, what it is like to be in a debate. Now, can a functionalist give a causal functional account for this? If not, then the state does not possess this qualitative feel cannot be a state of what it is like to be in a debate. Secondly, take intentionality. Mr. Barker thinks about his debate opponent, me. But what sense does it make to talk about one physical thing being about another physical thing? Lastly, we debate, there are norms of reason which tell us how we should reason, or how, given our beliefs, we ought to behave. On the functionalist account, though, this seems problematic. Indeed, one could be a zombie, this is David Chalmers' objection, functioning just like Dan and I, and therefore be said to have minds. Would anyone want to hear zombies debate? Other than in a horror flick, of course. Lastly, induction. There are also many problems with Mr. Barker's attempt attempted resolution of the problem of induction. First, it's a pragmatic justification and not an epistemic one. He said it just works. Secondly, the question is, what justifies you proceeding upon the expectation that the future will resemble the past? To say it's worked in the past, and since it's worked in the past, I can assume with probability that it'll work in the future, is to beg the question. Lastly, even Mr. Barker himself thinks that his secular answer doesn't cut it. On Losing Faith in Faith, page 61, Mr. Barker relays a story by Bertrand Russell. Basically, the story says that in the town of Changsha, during a lunar eclipse, blind men would beat gongs to frighten the heavenly dog who was attempting to swallow the moon. This practice has worked for thousands of years. The point is, just because something works does not mean it's rational. So Dan Barker's basic justification for induction is basically beating a gong. Now, of course, within my worldview, I don't have these problems. The problem here is that one needs a worldview in terms of which his beliefs are made intelligible, and atheism isn't that worldview. Simply put, if one believes that all that exists are marbles, then non-marbles will not be allowed in his worldview. If his worldview appeals to a non-marble to make his view that all that exists are marbles, then he undercuts his worldview. And so when Mr. Barker appeals to things like logic, induction, ethics, concepts, and minds, he's using non-marbles in his marble worldview. Facts are interpreted within a worldview. Logic, to just say it doesn't exist, that applies the laws of logic to saying it doesn't exist. You're saying it does not exist. This was mentioned by Aristotle thousands of years ago. If one does not have a proper worldview, the facts remain unintelligible. Picture it like a joke. I could tell a joke and insert the punchline of another joke as the punchline for the joke I told. If I did so, the joke would not be funny. It wouldn't be intelligible. Within my worldview, universal, immaterial, and unchanging laws of logic are not an automatic problem. They exist in my worldview, whereas Dan said they don't. Indeed, how could something like recognizing modalities have had any survival value for our hunter-gatherer ancestors? On the Christian worldview, it's God's very nature to think in terms of necessary truths. Indeed, on the Christian worldview, God is necessary. Given our story, where we are made in the image of God, who wants us to know facts about himself and the world, we can account for why we would think in these terms. In our worldview, the laws of logic reflect God's thinking, and thus it would account for why we have universal, immaterial, and invariant laws of logic. Or take induction. Given our presuppositions, God has made the world orderly and governs it according to his sovereign plan. He has told us in his world that we can expect nature to be uniform. And since he's a covenant-keeping God, we can count on his promises. And we're in a similar situation with morality. If you want moral absolutes, if you want to just condemn people and say that was absolutely wrong, it's absolutely wrong to torture little girls for the fun of it, for the mere fun of it, what you're going to need if you want to objectively morality and non-arbitrarily condemn or praise God's or Gandhi's actions, you need objective standards. There are real or moral obligations, and only persons can obligate us. There are universal obligations, obligated by the universal person, God. If you want to reject this, then it comes down to saying that while you like chocolate ice cream, some people like vanilla ice cream. And while you like to eat broccoli, some people like to eat other people. And that's it. Dan says you can't cause unnecessary harm. Unnecessary for what? For me to take his car, it might be necessary to beat him in the head. Now he might say, well, you shouldn't have taken my car then. It's necessary for me to satisfy my desires for Mr. Barker's car to take it. So he has no position on morality, and nothing that is rational tonight. The Christian worldview provides the proper story and makes the facts intelligible. Mr. Barker's atheist worldview does not. He is internally inconsistent and therefore irrational. But Mr. Barker continues to use things like logic and induction and ethics. Thus he's saying one thing but behaving another way. He shows that he sees the evidence of God's existence but then suppresses it. Therefore I maintain that the atheist is agent irrational with his respect to his lack of belief, and his lack of belief is non-rational. Lastly, in regards to his evidentialism, if we need evidence for every single claim, well, first off, he goes, I don't need to give evidence for logic and induction. Well, then I don't need to give evidence for God. Furthermore, do you have evidence for that belief? That you need evidence for every belief? And then when you give me evidence, do you have evidence to back that evidence? And then when you give me new evidence, do you have evidence to back the new evidence? See, Dan's caught in an infinite regress, and if he attempts to use classical foundationalism, he'll be refuted by the likes of Alvin Plantinga, who asks, well, what basis do you have to believe your foundation? It's not a deliverance of reason, and it's not a basic belief. So Dan's evidentialism, his reason for not believing in God, is therefore refuted. Thank you.